One of the things that really stood out to me in the data is how living near people who are similar to you leads to a more trusting relationship. But we live in a deeply segregated country. So often when we have these conversations, people say we need to talk to one another. But if you're not in community with people who are different from you, whether that's racially or in terms of income or education or political belief, how do we overcome that barrier?
What a great question. It's perhaps the American question, right? Let me get us started, and then perhaps Laura will add something. What we find, most importantly, is sameness is connected with trust, right? And if we are to define trust as what you assume about somebody in the absence of other information, right? Do you assume positive intent or not? Then perceiving diversity, whether that might be through race or ethnicity or other factors, that's a barrier, right? It's a powerful social cue that cues you in that maybe there's a difference here, maybe there isn't sameness here. But the important thing is sameness, right? People, when they perceive sameness, they are more likely to trust, right? But sameness is a perception, and it is not necessarily a reality. So it is possible that people might start perceiving sameness even when they're surrounded by diversity. But that needs to be intentional, right? You must make an effort to find sameness. So in some ways, right, Laura showed this is a newer challenge, right? Our country is diversifying in ways that we haven't experienced before. But I actually don't think it's such a new challenge. It's the same challenge we've always had as a country. It's just different now, right? So currently we have 14.8% of Americans are immigrants, right? But go back 1890, it was 14.3%. Our challenge has always been to sustain trust in a diverse country and how to see sameness in a country that is this diverse. That is the American experiment.
Well, it also makes me wonder whether the data says anything about whether Americans feel there is a shared identity.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight?
Yeah.
Americans feel less close to other Americans than any other country that we surveyed when we asked about this. So when we asked how close Americans feel to their local community, as well as how close they feel to other Americans, and this was in the context of, I'd say, about 20 countries that we surveyed, we stood out for being the lowest on both of those measures. So they're still relatively high. I think around 6 in 10 said they felt close in some way to either other Americans or their local community. But we kind of stand out when it comes to other countries for being on the less connected, less integrated, less likely to have a shared identity stage. I think it's also interesting in the context of this discussion, we don't have, pride at this point in being American is a partisan issue. Mm-hmm. Republicans are much more likely to say that they have pride in being American than are Democrats. And so it's difficult in our political context at times to figure out what is sameness.
Yeah. What's at the root of this distrust? I know that's a very complex issue to root out, but I wonder in your research how much you've come to understand about Americans' view of how much of this is a deliberate sowing of mistrust in one another, and how much of it is organic.
Yeah, a few years ago, we ran some focus groups among wide swaths of Americans, and we found that people know we have a problem, right? They can articulate clearly, they feel it in their bones that there is a problem with social trust in our country, and they do seem to blame our politics, right? But I guess this is where, as a researcher, I get a little lost because it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Is our politics reacting to a polarized public, right? And they're just giving back what they see? Or is it the other way, right? I guess what best thing we can say is a little bit of a loop, it's a little bit of a feedback loop. As Democrats and Republicans have just moved further and further apart, right? Our politics has also moved further and further apart. We were not this ideologically consistent in our attitudes in the 90s, right? And that all changed. So is it deliberate or not? It's really hard to say, but what we can say is there's a feedback loop going on between polarized politics and a polarized public and a polarized media environment.
Well, that makes me wonder about young people, because I think the data about this younger generation or generations, it's deeply disturbing to me. And when I talk to young people in my life, they often share this sense that there's not much hope for them to build the kind of life they've been told is possible in this country. How much is their distrust linked to a lack of optimism in around what's possible in the US?
That is a great question. So one thing to note is that young people are less trusting in most countries. So that is not a uniquely American phenomenon. However, it speaks to your other question, which is there are a lot of countries in which young people don't think they can build the economic life that they once could. When we look at our peer countries in Europe and their politics right now, I think that's a pretty shared concern, right? Can the next generation be better off? We ask that question often, so do other survey organizations. Young people don't think so. They don't think they're going to be able to build a better lives for their children, and they already think that their lives are going to be less kind of economically successful than their parents' generation. But you're exactly right that it is tied up in optimism, but it's tied up in a number of things, because we also see that younger people are more likely to say that they're lonely. Younger people are more likely to say that they are not optimistic about the future writ large, not just when it comes to their own economic successes. And we talked about all of these changes, but young people are feeling some of them probably more unequally than others, and I'd point you towards the social media and internet changes. We all probably remember a time before we were constantly on our phones, so we know what it was like before. A lot of young people don't. And what we're seeing from our work on teens, and we've done a lot of surveys related to teens, and most recently put out work on teens and social media and mental health, is that teens increasingly think that social media is having a negative impact on their generation. And that's changing from just a few years ago. So I think there is something unique about the teenage experience or the young person's experience in being pretty digitally native. And our data also suggests that young people think that COVID had more of a major impact on them. So there has been a lot of change in a relatively shorter lifespan for the youngest generation as well.
When we talk about technology, there's another big tech conversation happening right now around artificial intelligence and what that means for both our social and economic future here in this country and globally. Neha, when we talk about AI, how do people think about artificial intelligence and what it might mean for whether we grow closer as a country, whether it is another wedge, whether it is something we can look to help us build a stronger economic futures? What do they say?
Yeah. We have been polling on AI more recently, and people's opinions on AI are still forming. But one thing that's very clear, we put out a report on this, I think it was about last month. We asked the public about their perceptions of AI and whether it's going to be good for the United States or bad for the United States and what it'll mean for various jobs. And then we also asked the same questions of AI experts, scientists, people working in the field. There is a big gap between the experts' perceptions of what AI can do for the country and the general public's perception of what AI can do for the country. And you can guess the direction of the gap. The public is much more negative, right? Whereas the experts are much more positive. So when you have a gap like this, anytime you have a gap like this between the elite and the general public, it's concerning, right? It's a recipe for breeding mistrust, for mistrust of elites, for mistrust of institutions. And I think one of the challenges that the AI field will have going into the future is how to bridge this gap. How to take the public along with you, as you're here and the public's here. And they're figuring it out, and they are not trusting right now. So you got to build that trust. You got to take people along with you in this very fast-moving space. There's one more point here that's actually worth making, and that's AI and jobs. Right? Both the experts and the public agree that AI is going to change our jobs, right? And certain jobs are kind of ripe for job loss. And they both seem to agree that one of them is journalism, and one of them is factory workers. These jobs will change, and many of them might be lost, right? We know from our research that scarring events like job loss are connected with lower trust. Right? When people lose jobs, they start trusting less. So if there is a revolution coming with job loss related to AI, that's another factor that will add into that mix of mistrust.
Well, that's fascinating. Journalism is one of the places they identify as there being job loss. But then how does that reinforce this distrust in the information landscape? If you don't know where that information is coming from, if there's not a human being to hold accountable when information is shared incorrectly, is this just another feedback loop?
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening. We're seeing the loss in trust in legacy media, right? We've been seeing that and documenting that for a while. At the same time, you're seeing the rise of the influencer. Pew Research Center, the last study we did on this showed that 25% of Americans are relying on influencers for their news, right? So there are these changes that are kind of happening. People realize it, right? They're telling us that they have difficulty telling fact from fiction. At the same time, it's like you're flowing in a river and you can't stop.
One positive note, though, is that people do trust local media at higher rates than they trust national media. People also rely on local media more than they rely on national media. It's definitely the place where many to most Americans get their news. And so when we think about you all out in the community building trust, kind of having the local beat and sharing it with the local community, that remains more trusted than the national media.
Yeah, Orlando Bailey, that points to the work you're doing in Detroit and its importance. I want to invite anyone who has questions right now to come to one of the 4 mics that are placed in the room. Just step up and I will hopefully be able to see you from the stage. Where are the challenges and opportunities right now to strengthen trust in the country? What does the data tell us about that?
Do you want me to take a crack at challenges and opportunities? We showed you that trust is part and parcel of so many other social political changes that are taking place in the country. And there's really 2 ways you can look at that. One way is, oh my God, the best way to fix trust is to fix everything. Right? Fix education, fix neighborhoods, fix our politics, fix religion, fix it all and you'll fix trust, right? That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is there is so much swimming in the water, you could get in anywhere. Right? You could get in at the neighborhood level. We know that's connected with trust. You could get in at religious congregations level. We know that is connected with trust. You could get in with news. That's connected with trust. There are so many nodes, and there are so many entry points. So on the one hand, it's a little overwhelming. Oh my God, how do I fix trust? On the other hand, start anywhere. Right? And that could make a difference. That could fix trust somewhere.
Well, let's take some questions right here.
What does the research say about the connection, if there is one, between increasing wealth inequality and decline in social trust?
It's a great question. We know that when people think that institutions are unequal, when they think that the rich have too much power, which most Americans do think currently, this is related to less trust. And so as America has grown more unequal, there's a strong possible relationship between declining social trust. It's this idea that the them have something that you don't and that they're taking advantage of you. And we've measured this in a number of different ways, but that general sense that some people are getting more than their fair share of the pie is related to the sense that most people can't be trusted.
And in the report, we do have a section on this that shows the extent to which income inequality has increased in the United States. It's a very neat chart that you look at the chart and you know exactly what's going on. The one line goes up, the other line goes down, and you can guess which way those lines are going. For sure.
Let's take a question in the back. Yes.
Hi, thanks. My name's Tim Sarantonio. I'm Director of Community Engagement at Neon One and also Chair of the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. My question is actually concerned with parallel research that we've been doing at FEP, because we look at individual giving to nonprofits, and so it's the most comprehensive benchmarking research on individual giving. So we found in our most recent study in our Q4 report of 2024 giving that 96.9% of folks in America are giving under $5,000 a year. The narrative is typically dollars up, donors down, because the average everyday donor doesn't feel connected to things. So I'd be interested especially in your research around the connections between generosity behavior, and especially what was intriguing was the volunteer mention, any correlations between trust and generosity in what you've found. Thank you.
Yeah, we actually have a question in the report that you'll be able to see about whether or not people have donated in the last year. And we find that social trusters, people who say most people can be trusted, are significantly more likely to have donated money. We looked at that kind of through the lens of trust, but there are also other correlates of giving that we see. Obviously, it's related to income, education, and a number of other demographic factors. But yes, our data bear out the idea that social trust is related to charitable giving for certain.
And just really quickly, I'd like to pause. I don't know if it's possible to get Laura a handheld mic. Her mic is cutting out a bit, so I want to make sure everyone hears what she has to say, but we'll press ahead. Right here?
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for that presentation. I'm Anj Marie Hancock, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State. And I had a question. I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the differences. You talked about some inequality-based differences for why there might be people who trust less. And you talked a little bit about, from an economic or rational, kind of perspective, folks who are making less money, have less income, have less education, have less margin, right, to be able to fix a mistake in trust. And I wanted to delve a little deeper and see if there were any additional explanations. And I was thinking specifically about the idea that not having trust can often be a rational response. Right. So when you think about the racial differences that might exist, or you think about what Orlando was talking about earlier, and people thinking it's a scam. Of course, if you've been scammed in the past. So I wanted to ask both: are there explanations, or do you have data that would talk about past experiences or trust in different institutions, and whether or not that would be correlated? And really thinking about how institutions might also be responsible for rebuilding the trust, as opposed to just thinking there's a flaw in us as individuals needing to be more trusting.
Yeah. What a great question. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, social trust is a social good, but lack of trust is sometimes the most appropriate and rational response to a given situation. I mean, we will be releasing the results of a study we're doing on internet scams, right? I think it's going to come out maybe next month or soon after that, and we're going to be looking at older adults who we know are more trusting and falling for scams, right? Not opening the door when somebody knocks is a perfectly rational response if you live in a neighborhood where your experience tells you don't open the door. So what is the ideal level of trust in a society, right? It's probably not 100%, right? There's some level of mistrust that is actually a good thing. At the same time, we know that trust is connected with a variety of benefits, social benefits, personal benefits. So while trust is unequally distributed in society, and while it may be a perfectly rational response in a given situation, it does have a lot of benefits, right? So for it to be falling the way it's falling, and for it to be this unequally distributed, particularly by race, right? That is what gives us considerable pause as a country.
This middle mic, yes. Right there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for a really engaging and thoughtful presentation. I was really struck by the data around the increasing diversity of America, and yet the seemingly stabilization of trust. And I was wondering, how exactly is this happening? What is the mechanism? And I began to wonder if it was actually segregation, right? So something that has negative connotations typically if our immediate neighborhoods are very homogeneous and segregated. Is that actually a protective factor when it comes to trust, which is kind of striking and jarring and weird at the same time? So I just wanted to pick your brains on that.
I'll get going on this, and then maybe Laura can add on. I mean, I think one thing, Laura and I had several discussions about this. We're starting to see some stabilization, right, in trust, but we don't want to overstate this. We were kind of like, are we really doing a happy dance in front of a burning house? We don't want to leave people with the wrong impression, right? Oh, it's hope. We're seeing some early evidence, okay, that trust is stabilizing. It could be a COVID effect, right? Our country just went through something traumatic, and we know trust tends to rise, right, after traumatic events that happened after 9/11. This particular event did pull people apart physically and emotionally, so maybe that's why you're seeing not a rise, but a stabilization. But there are generational differences in trust. Right? So I'm not gonna bet on the future, but if I had to, right, unless younger generations change their mind, unless something changes in the way younger people think, that generational replacement is gonna catch up with us. Right? Are we going to see that stabilization into the future? I don't know. That generational difference is really stuck in my craw right now.
Well, just to follow up to that though, Neha, does the data tell us whether young people think about community in the same way? And I'm thinking about social media and the internet. It puts them in contact with people globally in a way that we didn't experience.
Great question. We've never asked directly, but if I had to kind of connect those dots, I mean, younger people at higher rates are telling us they're online almost constantly. Black and Latino youth are online almost constantly at higher rates than white youth. So they have got to be changing the way they think about community. Right? Maybe it's less about face-to-face.
That same question I mentioned about how close we feel to people around us and how close we feel to Americans.
Oh, pause for 1 second, Laura. Let's get you another mic.
Perfect. Do I need to?
This one? Okay. We also asked how close people feel to people all over the world, and younger people are slightly more likely to say they feel close to people all over the world. That's the case both in the US and internationally. So there may be a little bit more of a global community feeling that comes from being online almost constantly and interacting with difference, whether it be local difference, nationwide difference, or even international difference.
We have time for about 3 more questions quickly in the back microphone.
Would I be able to actually throw it to them on that side? Because they haven't had a chance to yet.
Oh, it's kind of hard to see all of the
That's all
microphones.
right.
Well then let's come here. Yeah, thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no.
Go ahead.
Such
That
a
is very
trusting-
kind of you.
Building trust.
I want to yield. Yeah, thank you. Great example. I want to yield back my time, but I've got the mic now, so I'm going to take it. Thank you very much. My name's Keith Daly. I'm with the Kroger Company. I'm also here as a guest of the CEO of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, where I serve on the board. And I've come across research, not Pew Research. It actually came from Brunswick Group, based here in Chicago, about the rise of super distrusters in the United States. So what they found is a quarter of the population are super distrusters, which I'm oversimplifying, but essentially they distrust any institution, government, business, leaders, CEOs, elected officials, you name it. And I'm curious, one, if you're familiar with that, if you have a point of view on it, but it makes me wonder, is the intensity of distrust perhaps part of the challenge today? And if there might be correlation or causation between that idea and some of your findings.
Yeah. It's almost tautological, but in my mind, it's quite interesting. Truster is going to trust, right? Distrust is going to distrust. So people who don't trust, institutional mistrust and social trust is tied together. People will even articulate that for you. A few months ago, we ran some focus groups among low trust individuals. And what I was really struck by from that discussion was people were telling us, if there's an institution behind what you're hearing, then don't trust it. Right? So they were saying this in relation to the news media. You might be interested in this. They were telling us that journalists are not doing research. Right? They are not out there talking to people and gathering data and then telling you what the story really is. If a journalist is working for an institution, NPR, CBS, whatever it might be, they are reading from a script of what the institution wants them to read. And that is all they're doing. All institutions have an agenda. So if there's an institution behind it, don't trust it. So that's the complete opposite, right? Don't trust institutions, don't trust experts, don't trust, and then that translates to don't trust each other. So what you're calling super trusters, I say, okay, distruster is going to distrust, truster is going to trust, right? So, but I'd be really interested in what you're finding in this other research that you're citing.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. However, we have lots of time across the day for you to connect with Neha and Laura and learn more about their research. You can find the research online. It's live now. And of course, we have the longest table lunch. So lots of opportunities for you to connect with them. Just as we wrap up here, just one question you'd like us to ask ourselves as we go about the day and engage with one another.
I think we'd be curious what resonates with you. How does this fit with your experience building trust? How does it look similar or different? Because we'd like to hear from you. It helps us inform our research going forward. Yeah. And if I can make one quick plug, our report is now at pewresearch.org/social trust. So hopefully easy for you to find if you didn't get the QR code before.
My challenge as a researcher, but perhaps this is your challenge as well, is when it comes to some of the diversity numbers and the changing face of America and how that's tied with trust, what we find is people constantly tend to overestimate the demographic change. Right? It's happening so fast that they feel it in their bones very intensely. And when you ask them, say in Europe, we've asked people, what share of the population do you think is Muslim? And they will guess like double or triple the number that's actually true, right? There was one study where the survey researcher asked Republicans what share of Democrats are LGBTQ, and they said like 40%, right? It's nowhere close to that. But these perceptions are coming from a place of fear, right? And when you encounter fear and you encounter misperception, the best thing you can do is shine the light of transparency. Right? These are the numbers. That's why we gave you the numbers. Right? These are the authoritative numbers of how the country is changing demographically. This deserves an honest discussion. We know from the research that sameness is tied to trust and what the challenge of this country is going forward. This deserves an honest conversation.
Laura, Neha, thank you so much.